Before we dive into one of the most haunting warnings in Australian military history, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. What you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a mirror reflecting choices nations make when comfortable voices drown out uncomfortable truths. Darwin, February 1942. The northern gateway to Australia, and on a humid Thursday morning at 9:58 a.m., the sky turned black with 188 Japanese aircraft. Within 40 minutes, 243 people would be dead. The PECO harbor would be a graveyard of sunken ships, the RAAF base would be obliterated, and half the civilian population would flee south in what history would mockingly call the Adelaide River Stakes. But here's what makes this tragedy unbearable. Every single death, every ship sunk, every life shattered, it was all predicted, warned about, pleaded for attention, by one man. A squadron leader who had seen this exact nightmare play out before, who begged his superiors to listen, who laid out precisely what would happen if they didn't act. His name was Garnet Malley. And this is the story of how institutional arrogance, comfortable assumptions, and the deadliest words in any language, "She'll be right, mate," turned prophecy into massacre. You need to understand something about Squadron Leader Garnet Malley that made him fundamentally different from the officers who would dismiss him. While they were flying peacetime patrols over the Australian coast, practicing textbook maneuvers in friendly skies, Malley had been in China. Not as a tourist, not as an observer safely removed from danger. He had been there on Chinese airfields when the Japanese came. He had witnessed what modern air power, Japanese air power specifically, did to unprepared bases. He had seen bombers materialize out of clear skies and reduce entire airfields to smoking craters in minutes. He had watched fighters strafe anything that moved, turning hangars into funeral pyres and parked aircraft into twisted metal sculptures. He had held dying Chinese aviators in his arms and heard the screaming of aircraft engines mixed with the screaming of men. And he had learned the most crucial lesson that his Australian colleagues, safe in their peacetime routines, had never faced. Modern warfare doesn't give you second chances. There is no learning on the job when the bombs are already falling. When Malley returned to Australia in early 1941, he carried something his superiors didn't, the weight of having seen the future. He knew, with the certainty that only comes from living through hell, that if Japan entered the war, Australian bases in the north would be primary targets. And he knew, with equal certainty, that they were catastrophically unprepared. So when he was sent to inspect Darwin's defenses in late 1941, he didn't just file a routine report. He wrote what amounted to a survival manual. "Disperse your aircraft," he pleaded. "Don't park them in neat rows where one bomber can destroy them all. Build revetments, earthen walls to protect planes from blast damage. Harden your facilities. Create redundant command structures. Install proper air raid shelters. Train your personnel in rapid response protocols. Establish a reliable early warning system. Most critically, take the threat seriously. Not theoretically, not as a distant possibility. As an imminent reality that could arrive tomorrow." The response? Silence. Then dismissal. Then something worse than either. Polite acknowledgement followed by complete inaction. The report went into a filing cabinet somewhere in Melbourne. Not a single recommendation was implemented. Not one aircraft was dispersed. Not one revetment was built. Not one shelter was hardened. The neat rows of planes sat there, gleaming targets on the tarmac. And Malley, this quiet, unassuming officer who had seen men die for precisely this kind of complacency, was treated like an alarmist, an overcautious worrier who didn't understand that this was Australia. That we were protected by distance, by the might of the British Empire, by the comforting assumption that the war was happening somewhere else to someone else. But Malley wasn't alone in his warnings. Others saw the danger too. In January 1942, just weeks before the attack, John Dedman from the Prime Minister's Department wrote to the Premier of New South Wales requesting a second fire engine for Darwin, explicitly stating, "Darwin is in danger of an attack from the air." The Americans who visited northern Australian bases were appalled by what they found. After visiting Batchelor Airfield near Darwin, General Louis Brereton described it as rudimentary. 3 American B-17 bombers had already crashed trying to land there. Another U.S. general observed that Australia is as undeveloped as the central United States was before the Civil War, or even more so. These weren't casual observations. They were alarm bells. But in Canberra and Melbourne, where the war still felt distant and abstract, where meetings were held in comfortable offices far from any threat, these warnings collided with something more powerful than logic: institutional inertia. The machine of military bureaucracy, grinding slowly, resistant to urgency, convinced that procedures and protocols mattered more than preparation. Here's what the men in Darwin didn't know as they went about their duties in early February 1942. They didn't know that on February 10th, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had overflown their town, photographing every ship in the harbor, every aircraft on the ground, counting their defenses, noting their positions, mapping their vulnerabilities. They didn't know that the same commander who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, Mitsuo Fuchida, was now planning their destruction. They didn't know that 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were steaming south through the Timor Sea, carrying 188 attack aircraft armed with hundreds of bombs specifically selected to maximize destruction of ships, fuel tanks, and infrastructure. And they didn't know that their own radar station at Dripstone Caves, the one system that might have given them critical warning time, wasn't operational yet. Still being assembled, still waiting for parts, still in progress, while time ran out. February 19, 1942, began like any other morning in Darwin. The sun rose over a harbor crowded with 47 ships, destroyers, merchant vessels, supply ships. The RAAF base hummed with routine activity. Aircraft parked in those neat, convenient rows that made maintenance so efficient. At the Larrakia barracks, soldiers of the 23rd Infantry Brigade prepared for another day. In town, civilians went about their business, the population now swollen with military personnel and evacuees from elsewhere. The war still felt far away. Singapore had fallen just 4 days earlier, yes. The Japanese were advancing through the Pacific, yes. But this was Australia. Surely we were safe. Surely they wouldn't come here. Then, at 9:15 a.m., everything changed. John Gribble, a coast watcher on Melville Island, spotted them first. A massive formation of aircraft heading south toward Darwin. He immediately radioed the naval station, large numbers of aircraft approaching. Minutes later, Father John McGrath from the Catholic Mission on Bathurst Island sent the same warning to Lou Kernock at the Australian Amalgamated Wireless Station. Kernock transmitted it immediately to the RAAF Operations Centre. 43 minutes of warning. 43 minutes to scramble fighters, to move ships, to get personnel to shelter, to prepare anti-aircraft batteries, to sound alarms throughout the city. 43 minutes that could have saved dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives. The RAAF Operations Centre received the warnings and did nothing, despite the clear reports from 2 separate reliable coast watchers, despite the obvious threat, despite everything that Garnet Malley had warned them about. The officers at the Operations Centre looked at those warnings and made a decision that would haunt Australian military history. They assumed, that word again, the most dangerous word in warfare. They assumed the aircraft must be American P-40 Kittyhawks returning from a sortie to Timor. Never mind that the direction was wrong. Never mind that no such large formation was expected. Never mind the repeated warnings. They assumed. Ships weren't moved. Aircraft weren't scrambled. Personnel weren't alerted. The harbor remained full. The USA airfield remained exposed. The city remained unwarned. And at 9:58 a.m., when those first bombs began to fall, the men of Darwin finally understood what Garnet Malley had been trying to tell them. But by then, understanding was measured in bodies. The attack was methodical, professional, devastating. Kate bombers struck the harbor first, their bombardiers having studied those reconnaissance photos, knowing exactly where to place each bomb for maximum effect. The motor vessel Neptuna, loaded with 200 depth charges, exploded at the wharf in a blast so massive it created its own firestorm. The destroyer USS Peary, caught completely off guard, took multiple direct hits and went down within minutes. 88 men dying in the water or trapped below decks as the ship rolled. Val dive bombers, protected by Zero fighters, screamed down on the RAAF base, systematically destroying every single aircraft on the ground. Those neat rows of planes that maintenance crews loved, they became a conveyor belt of destruction. One bomb would take out 3, 4, 5 aircraft at once. The Americans scrambled 10 P-40 Kittyhawks into the air, the full strength of their defense. Within minutes, 9 of them were shot down. The pilots, brave and determined, had trained for aerial combat. But they hadn't trained for this. For overwhelming numerical superiority. For Zeros that could outturn, outclimb, and outfight anything they'd encountered. For an enemy that had been practicing this exact type of attack for years while Australia slept. On the ground, the chaos was total. Anti-aircraft batteries, desperately trying to respond, found themselves overwhelmed. There were simply too few guns, positioned in too few locations, manned by crews who had never faced an attack of this scale. Wing Commander Archibald Tyndall, at just 26 years old, the RAAF's most senior officer in the Northern Territory, grabbed a Lewis gun and fired at the relentless Japanese bombers until a bomb cut him down. Soldiers fired. rifles at aircraft 10,000 feet overhead, a futile gesture of defiance that spoke to their courage and their complete lack of preparation. At the post office, staff members who might have escaped with 20 minutes warning died at their posts. On the wharves, workers who should have been in shelters were caught in the open, torn apart by shrapnel and blast waves. In the harbor, sailors on ships that should have been moved to safety abandoned burning vessels or died trying to fight fires fed by aviation fuel and explosives. 40 minutes after it began, the first attack was over. Darwin's harbor was a scene of apocalyptic devastation. 8 ships sunk or sinking, another 14 damaged, fires raging out of control. The wharf area looking like a vision of hell, with burning oil spreading across the water, depth charges detonating underwater creating geysers of flame and debris, and the continuous sound of ammunition cooking off. The RAAF base was obliterated, every aircraft destroyed. Hangars collapsed, fuel tanks blazing. The town itself had taken hits, civilian areas bombed, services disrupted, communications cut. And the human cost? Bodies everywhere. In the water, on the wharves, in the wreckage of ships, scattered across the airfield. The injured crying out for help that couldn't reach them fast enough. Then, as survivors began to emerge from whatever cover they'd found, as rescue workers started pulling wounded from the wreckage, the sound came again. Aircraft engines. At 11:58 a.m., 80 minutes after the first attack ended, 54 land-based bombers from Kendari and Ambon arrived for the second wave. This time they concentrated on finishing off the RAAF base, ensuring that it couldn't be used to launch any counterattack. For 20 more minutes, the bombs fell. When silence finally returned to Darwin, when the last Japanese aircraft disappeared to the north, and the continuous thunder of explosions gave way to the roar of fires and the screams of the wounded, the full scope of the catastrophe became clear. At least 243 people dead, though the true number would never be known with certainty. Some bodies were never found, vaporized in explosions or buried in wreckage or lost in the harbor. Another 300 to 400 wounded, many critically, 10 ships sunk, 25 damaged, 23 aircraft destroyed, and something else destroyed that day, something harder to quantify but just as real. Australia's sense of invulnerability. The comfortable assumption that the war was happening somewhere else. The belief that distance and British protection made us safe. All of it, shattered in 60 minutes of mechanized violence. The aftermath was in some ways as devastating as the attack itself. In the hours following the raids, believing invasion was imminent, approximately half of Darwin's civilian population fled south. This wasn't an orderly evacuation. This was panic. Cars overloaded with possessions. People on foot carrying whatever they could grab. The road south clogged with refugees, in such chaos that history would call it the Adelaide River Stakes, or the Darwin Races, darkly humorous names for a mass flight driven by terror. At the RAAF base, something even more troubling unfolded. Wing Commander Stuart Griffiths, the base commander, gave what he later claimed was an order to regroup half a mile down the road. But among frightened, traumatized airmen who had just watched their entire base obliterated, who had seen friends die, who believed the Japanese were about to land, that order was heard as "Go Bush." And they did, in significant numbers. Some didn't stop running for days. One airman reportedly made it all the way to Melbourne, covering thousands of kilometers driven by pure terror. Looting began almost immediately. Houses and businesses abandoned in the panic were stripped by civilians, and shamefully by some military personnel. Order would eventually be restored, but not before the breakdown revealed how completely unprepared Australia had been, not just militarily but psychologically, for war on its own soil. And through all of this, the death, the destruction, the panic, the chaos, one man's warnings echoed with unbearable clarity. Garnet Malley had told them. He had told them exactly what would happen. He had described it in detail. The vulnerability of concentrated aircraft, the inadequacy of defenses, the need for hardened facilities, the critical importance of early warning, systems and rapid response protocols. He had warned them with the authority of someone who had lived through these attacks, who knew the Japanese tactics, who understood what modern air power could do to an unprepared target. And every single thing he had warned about had come to pass, precisely as predicted. The neat rows of aircraft destroyed in minutes. The lack of proper shelters, resulting in unnecessary casualties. The failure to act on early warnings, costing 43 minutes that could have saved lives. The inadequate anti-aircraft defenses, overwhelmed immediately. The lack of coordination between services, creating confusion and paralysis. It was as if Malley had written a script for the disaster and Australia had followed it perfectly. In late March 1942, the Australian government appointed a royal commission under Justice Charles Lowe to investigate what had gone wrong at Darwin. The hearings, some held in the ruins of the town itself, made for brutal reading. The CJT Commission found that military leadership had made catastrophic errors at every level. The failure to act on coastwatcher warnings was inexcusable. The concentration of aircraft was militarily indefensible. The lack of coordination between services had directly contributed to the high casualty count. The inadequate preparations, despite clear evidence of the Japanese threat, represented a massive failure of leadership. The report was released in 1945, once the immediate security concerns had passed. But for those who had been warning about these exact vulnerabilities, for men like Garnet Malley, the Commission's findings must have been cold comfort. It confirmed what they already knew. People had died unnecessarily. Ships had been lost unnecessarily. Darwin had been devastated unnecessarily. All because warnings from the field were dismissed by brass who preferred comfortable assumptions to uncomfortable truths. But here's where the story takes a turn that speaks to something profound about human nature and institutional learning. After Darwin, everything changed. The government and military, shocked into awareness by the attack, finally listened to the experts they should have heeded months earlier. Suddenly, Garnet Malley's recommendations, filed away, ignored, dismissed, were pulled out and implemented with frantic urgency. Aircraft were dispersed, revetments were built, command and control systems were established. Most critically, that radar station at Dripstone Caves was rushed into operation. Early warning networks were set up across northern Australia, with coastwatchers and observers creating overlapping coverage. Fighter squadrons were reinforced, anti-aircraft batteries were properly positioned and supplied. Training became intensive and realistic. And the effect was dramatic. When the Japanese returned, and they did return, conducting another 63 raids on Darwin and over 200 attacks across northern Australia between February 1942 and November 1943, they never again achieved anything close to the devastation of February 19th. The defenses that should have existed before the first attack were now in place. And they worked. Japanese aircraft were shot down. Raids were disrupted. Damage was minimized. Lives were saved. Garnet Malley, the quiet officer whose warnings had been ignored, found himself in an unexpected position. The same brass who had dismissed his concerns now sought his expertise. His experience in China, once considered the alarmist ravings of an overcautious observer, was now recognized as invaluable intelligence. He helped design the new defensive systems. He trained personnel in rapid response protocols. He taught what he had learned in China about Japanese tactics and how to counter them. In meetings where once his voice had been the one dismissed, it was now the one everyone listened to. But for Malley, and we can only imagine this from the historical record, the vindication must have been agonizing. Because every life saved by the new systems was also a reminder of every life that could have been saved if those systems had existed on February 19th. Every successful defense of Darwin after the first attack was proof that the disaster could have been prevented. The same people who had ignored him before now thanked him for his help. They praised his expertise. They acknowledged his foresight. And he had to smile and accept their gratitude while remembering the bodies in Darwin Harbor, the burning aircraft, the preventable deaths. This is the part of the story that breaks my heart. Because it's so quintessentially human. The antagonists in this story, the comfortable brass who dismissed Malley's warnings, the politicians who prioritized appearances over preparation, the institutional culture that valued protocol over urgency, they weren't monsters. They were just people. People who made catastrophically bad decisions because they were comfortable, because accepting the warnings would have required uncomfortable actions, because it's easier to assume the expert is being alarmist than to confront the possibility that he's right. And when they were proven wrong in the most terrible way possible, when the bodies were counted and the wreckage was surveyed and the truth was undeniable, they had to live with that. They had to face the families of the dead. They had to read the Commission's findings. They had to acknowledge that they had been wrong and people had paid for their mistake with their lives. Some of them, and the historical record hints at this, were broken by that knowledge. Career officers resigned. Politicians left public life. Some carried the guilt for the rest of their lives. Because at the end of the day, when institutional failure becomes personal tragedy, when policy decisions translate to body counts, even the most hardened bureaucrat has to confront his own humanity. The story of Garnet Malley and Darwin 1942 resonates today because the pattern is eternal. In every generation, in every institution, there are people with field experience, with specialized knowledge, with uncomfortable truths that need to be heard. And in every generation, there are comfortable people in positions of authority who find it easier to dismiss those warnings than to act on them. Before the financial crisis,